Welcome, thanks for joining us. Now, I know we've got a lot to get through today, having had a sneak peek of Matt's presentation. So I'm going to start kicking us off. For those who haven't met me before, my name is Malia and I'm part of the community team here at Blackbird. And I'd like to first begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. So we pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and we acknowledge their spiritual connection to country. As I mentioned, I'm part of the team at Blackbird, and today I am joined by Matt Hinds, who's a product manager at SafetyCulture, and he's going to be talking to us about building design thinking to build products and services. Now, alongside his product management experience at SafetyCulture, Matt is a former founder himself. Prior to joining the company, he worked at Amazon Web Services and founded 2 startups, one of which, AdCrowd, was acquired in 2019. Matt writes about product management, startups, and industry problems we're solving over on his Medium if you want to get some more wisdom from him. But in the meantime, he's going to be taking us through a session on what it means to have a design thinking approach, how you can implement this for your own startup, and some examples and tips on how to get started. Now, as usual, we'll have about 10 minutes at the end of the session for a Q&A. So if you have any questions as we go, please send them through using the Q&A function in Zoom. And if you use the chat function, you'll see a little note from me just telling you to head on over to the Q&A and put your questions in there. Anyway, let's get started. Over to you, Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Melia, and hello, Blackbird community. Really excited to join you on a Tuesday morning to chat design thinking. Let me know when you can see my screen. Yep. Awesome. The topic this morning is design thinking to build products and services. This is actually a topic I wish I knew a lot more about before I built my first startup. And so today I'm going to try and share as much as I know about design thinking in about 20 minutes. My aim for this talk is for you to go away, solve some really important customer problems, and build some really successful products and services. So who am I? My name is Matt. I'm currently a product manager at SafetyCulture. For those that don't know SafetyCulture, we're a Sydney-based unicorn SaaS and Blackbird portfolio company. We have just over 26,000 customers, including Amazon, BHP, Walt Disney, and we actually use design thinking every single day to build products for hundreds of thousands of operations and frontline workers. Prior to SafetyCulture, I was working at Amazon Web Services, so I was in the commercial side of the business, working with hundreds of startups and scale-ups across Australia. Before AWS, I was building my own startup. So as Melia mentioned, started off by building an e-commerce business and then jumped in to build a fintech startup. And we took the startup from ideation through to market and then through to acquisition. I'm also a massive startup nerd. You can often find me exploring new industry problems or meeting with really interesting founders. And so very happy to chat to anyone after. I think what really excites me about startups is that they are a catalyst for positive change in the world. They're often full of really smart people that are out to make a big impact. They're really impact driven. They're out to solve big problems and they're building something bigger than them. This is a space that really excites me. So what are we actually going to cover today? First, I'm going to demystify what design thinking actually is. Then we're going to dive into why we're actually here today. Why are we talking about design thinking? Then I'm going to share a personal story of how I failed to adopt design thinking in the early days of building one of my startups. Then we're going to jump through how can you design think. I'm going to run you through the double diamond process, which is the core framework of design thinking. And then we're going to sum it all up in a few key takeaways that you can go and action today. So what actually is design thinking? Now, I've been chatting to quite a few people over the last few weeks, and a common misconception that I hear about design thinking is design thinking is an end process, that it's the act of producing something, like some nice colors on a page. Design thinking is actually an idea. It's a method, it's an approach, it's a way of seeing the world. It's actually about understanding and solving customer problems. Now, the practice of design thinking, it's been happening for many decades. It actually wasn't until about 20 years ago that the term was popularized by IDEO, a San Francisco-based leading design agency. Tim Brown, IDEO CEO, he defined design thinking as a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. Design thinking is truly available to anyone. You don't actually have to be a designer to be a design thinker, and it helps you achieve a more intentional outcome when you're building a product or a service. So why are we actually here today? Why are we talking about design thinking? A lot of us on the call are probably startup founders, or we're supporting startups as advisors or investors. And something we all have in common is that we want our startups to succeed, right? Design thinking directly seeks to mitigate several of the key reasons for why startups fail. If you have a look at this chart on the screen, these are the top 10 reasons for startups failing. Number one is no market need. Beyond this includes pricing and cost issues, poor product, lacking a business model, ignoring customers. Design thinking directly seeks to establish all of these from the very beginning. Now, a lot of us on the call, then we might have heard of Y Combinator, really famous startup incubator based out of San Francisco. Y Combinator boasts startup alumni like Airbnb, Dropbox, and many more. Y Combinator's tagline is literally make something people want, which is the core of design thinking. So I'm going to share a personal story now, one in which I failed to adopt design thinking in the early days of building one of my startups, AgCrowd. So we were a fintech startup. The problem we were solving was that there is a serious lack of funding into the agricultural sector. And so we were creating an online investment marketplace which connected agricultural companies raising funding with investors. If you think about any marketplace startup, they have two sets of customers always. They have supply and demand. If you think about Uber, they have drivers as their supply and riders as their demand. If you think about Airbnb, they have hosts as their supply and guests as their demand. As for us at AgCrowd, we had companies raising funding as our supply and investors as our demand. At this point, we were a relatively early stage startup. We had a pretty small team, about 3 full-time founders, a few part-time people. And given such limited resources, we had to pick one of the sides of the marketplaces to focus the majority of our time on. And so we always believe that great deals and great companies bring investors. And so we decided to focus the majority of our time on the company side of the marketplace. So we spent a lot of time here. We validated the company side relatively well, I'd say. We visited our companies in different cities. We watched them struggle to raise funding from traditional financing methods. We really tried to immerse ourselves in their shoes to empathize with the problems that they were facing. On the investor side, I'd say we had a bit less time. We still managed to interview quite a lot of investors, and we'd ask them questions like, would you invest in the agricultural sector? Would you invest via an online investment marketplace? Would you sacrifice some financial return for social return or impact? All of which at the time received a resounding yes. But when we took the startup to market, we actually realized these were the wrong questions to be asking. When people's indicated desire to invest in something good and something impact focused did not actually translate into actual investment. So by this point, we had built our product, we'd raised some funding, we took our startup to market, we'd even got our first few customers. We actually failed to build a sustainable business which repeatedly solved problems for both sets of our customers, particularly the investor side. I actually truly believe this was down to us not fully adopting the design thinking approach from the very beginning. So I'm going to share 3 key learnings which I've tried to distill from our journey for you today. The first was one in which simply asking questions like, would you do this or would you want this is just not enough. Interviews and surveys as research methods actually rarely yield the most important insights. And even asking these types of questions is actually flawed. Humans struggle to predict how they'll behave in a future scenario. And so to fully understand how someone will behave, you need to fully immerse yourself in the customer's shoes. Henry Ford actually summed this up really well. He said, if I asked my customers what they would have wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Henry Ford would never have built a car if he listened to what his customers would have wanted. The second lesson is a trap that I see a lot of first-time founders fall into. It's one that we definitely fell into, which is thinking that anyone that disagrees with you just doesn't get it. And you spend a lot of your time trying to convince no's into yeses. This is really a black hole. You can essentially spend indefinite amount of time here. Would really encourage you to focus on your early adopters and focus on people who are willing to give you feedback in the early days. The third lesson is to be fully problem focused and solution agnostic. Saying things like, I want to build an app is not the right way to approach a problem. Does the problem even need an app? I'd argue that we prematurely built an investment product at this point. We got really excited by the macro trends and the validation on the company side, but we realized too late that we were asking the wrong questions and incorrectly validated the investor side. This is where I truly believe that design thinking can really change the game for anyone on this call. And I actually wish I knew a lot more about this topic before I built my first startup. So by this point, you might be wondering, how can I start design thinking? How can I take everything I'm learning today and actually build it into my products and services? If there's one thing I want you to remember from this talk, it's called the double diamond, which is the core framework of design thinking. There's actually two thought processes which run throughout both of the diamonds here. The first is called divergent thinking, where as the diamonds expand, you're generating many ideas. And then convergent thinking. So as the diamonds narrow, you're thinking really deep and taking focused action and narrowing down on the best ideas. It is actually normally a 4-stage process. I've extended it to 6 because I want to make it really actionable for everyone on the call today. And I'm going to run you through each stage of the double diamond and contextualize it through the story of a company we all know and the most likely customers of, Airbnb. For those that don't know Airbnb, they are a vacation rental online marketplace. Last time I checked, they're valued at about $135 billion, which is pretty amazing. But this wasn't always the case. In 2009, Airbnb actually almost went bust. They launched and barely anyone noticed. Their revenue was flatlining at about $200 per week, split between 3 founders living in the expensive San Francisco. This essentially meant near indefinite losses on zero growth. By the end of 2009, there were 3 founders. You can see them on the bottom left there. Joe Gerbier and Brian Chesky. They were accepted into Y Combinator, the startup incubator I mentioned earlier. Now, Y Combinator CEO Paul Graham, he's a really interesting guy. He tends to stump founders with deceptively simple questions. And so the first conversation went a little like this. Where is your business? Paul asked. Well, we don't have much traction, but there's a few people in New York using it, Brian said. So your users are in New York and you're still in San Francisco. What are you still doing here? Go to New York, get to know your customers, and go and meet them one by one, Paul said. But that won't scale. If we're huge and we have millions of customers, there's no way we can go and meet every single one, Brian said. That's exactly why you should go and do it now. You're small enough that you can go and meet all of your customers. So go to New York, go and meet your customers, and build something directly for them. Brian and Joe, they literally jumped on a plane, they flew over to New York, and they started knocking on the doors of their customers. This takes us to the first stage of the double diamond, the empathize stage. During the empathize stage, you're seeking to acquire a really deep understanding of the problem you're trying to solve. The best way to do this is to fully immerse yourself in the customer's shoes. I think it's pretty obvious that you cannot solve problems for people you don't know. And so you need to fully immerse yourself there. Go and spend time with them. Go and hang out where they hang out. Go and speak to them, even read what they read. If you think about the Airbnb example, Brian and Joe, they jumped on a plane, they went to New York, they started knocking on their customers' doors. They even slept on the couches where the host would let them. They identified 2 key problems here that were actually vital to the future success of the company. The first was that hosts were taking pictures with their camera phones. Now, in 2009, camera phones, they're pretty poor quality photos. And so hosts were uploading these poor quality photos to the listings and people could hardly even see what they were paying for. And so guests would not book. The second was that hosts were uncomfortable with unknown people staying in their house. And they actually had no way to tell who was on the other side of the booking. What I recommend to everyone on this call is next time you go and do your customer interviews, let's say you go to do 10 customer interviews, take 5 of those customers and actually go and visit your customers in person. Go and visit them in the environment in which you're building for them. Don't ask them questions like, would you do this? Or would you want this? Ask them bigger questions like, what is your day-to-day like? What are you trying to achieve? Who do you interact with? What really frustrated you today? If you could change anything, what would it be? I think if you ask these questions, you'll genuinely be surprised with some of the problems that you uncover. So now you've empathized with your customers, you have generated some key insights across your interviews and your site visits, and now you're going to go into the definition stage. Here you're taking everything you've generated and you're starting to draw some common insights. What's really important here is that you fully focus on the problem. You don't go into solution mode here. Something I find quite useful, it's called the jobs to be done framework, really common framework, you can Google it. Essentially, you are writing what the user is trying to achieve in a single statement. So you would write the persona, who they are, and what they're trying to achieve. If you think about the Airbnb example, they had two jobs to be done. The first was that hosts need to post photos of their home online. This was currently problematic because they're currently posting really poor quality photos, which means that guests can't even see what they're paying for. The second job to be done is that hosts want to know who their guests are before they stay in their home. This is currently problematic because hosts don't even know who is booking it. Something I'd recommend to everyone on this call is to take the key insights you've generated during your interviews and during your site visits, write who the user is, who is the persona you're designing for, and write the jobs to be done. What are they actually trying to achieve? If you don't come across anything novel or breakthrough here, I think it could be an early sign that you are either building a product for yourself or for nobody. So you have your problems, you've defined what they're actually trying to achieve. Now it's time to ideate. So stage 3 is ideation. You are brainstorming multiple ideas to solve the problem. Really important that you focus on a volume and variety of ideas. This is not the time to go really deep and narrow. If we go to the Airbnb example, they had identified some of the problems their customers were facing. They identified what their customers were trying to achieve, and they started brainstorming. They said, what if we were to hire a photographer? What if we were to buy our own camera? What if we created some guest profiles? Maybe we could create a peer-to-peer review system. What I'd recommend here is that you use a tool like Miro. It's essentially just a virtual whiteboard, but your whole team can jump on it remotely. You can use stickies, really neat tool, and start brainstorming a large volume and variety of ideas. There's many canvases you can use online. One that I recommend is called the Idea Canvas, just a really neat way to organize your thoughts. Taking all the ideas you've generated now, you're going to start prototyping. So stage 4 is prototype. Here, you're taking all the ideas you've generated and you're creating prototypes which allow you to get real feedback from your customers. Really important in the early stages to focus on low fidelity prototypes. And so low fidelity prototypes, they're really simple, they're fast, they're cheap, really different from a high fidelity prototype like the one on the right, which is a bit more realistic, it's a bit more interactive, it's a bit more functional. There's two reasons you'd want to focus on low fidelity, at least in the early stages of design thinking. The first is that you're going to be testing so many ideas at this point and getting really quick feedback from customers. And the only way you can do this sustainably is to keep it really simple. And the second is that low fidelity prototypes actually solicit a different type of feedback from customers. If you show a customer the screen like the one on the left, which is pretty blank, it doesn't have too much in the boxes, they're going to focus their feedback around what would they wish could be on the screen? What would they expect to be on the screen? What should be in the boxes? Whereas if you show them a high fidelity prototype, they're most likely going to focus on things like what the color of the button should be and the size of the text and the font, both really important, but at different stages in the journey. And so as you start out, focus on low fidelity. And as you move further and further into the design thinking and product development process, you're going to develop lower amount of prototypes, but they're going to be high resolution. If we go back to the Airbnb example, Brian and Joe's version of prototyping was buying cameras, taking them to the customers' homes and seeing if improved quality photos actually had an impact on guest booking. The second was they essentially created a draft guest profile, which they were able to put in front of hosts and get feedback on whether this satisfied their need. Something I'd recommend here is to start sketching. Some of my best prototypes have come on the back of a napkin. You really don't have to be too fancy about this. It's just something to get real feedback from customers. The second is a tool like Figma. We use this every day at SafetyCulture. It's a really awesome tool. It's totally free of charge. You can create some low fidelity prototypes on here and you actually just do not have to be a designer to use it. I use it every day and I'm not a designer. Really neat because you can start linking together some wireframes and make some buttons interactive and get it in front of a customer for them to use quite quickly. The second last stage of the double diamond is stage 5, the testing stage. So here you're taking all the prototypes that you've developed and you're starting to get real feedback from customers. A rule of thumb that I always use is test with at least 50 to 100 people across both your low fidelity and your high fidelity prototypes and focus on them showing you how they use it, not you guiding them. You can ask them questions like, how did that make you feel? What did you like? What didn't you like? What would you change? If we look at the Airbnb example, they were testing if high quality photos were actually better for guests. Did taking these photos actually impact guest booking? The second is that they created a draft guest profile and put this in front of a host and said, what's missing? And the host came back with things like, well, we want to see a profile photo. We want to know where they went to work. We want to know where they went to school. And Brian and Joe were literally able to start building touch point by touch point. An action here for everyone on this call is to go to a site like usertesting.com. This is an awesome site. We use it every day at SafetyCulture too. Essentially, you can, in theory, upload a prototype today, send it out to potentially hundreds of thousands of customers and get real feedback in a matter of a few days. Or you can send it out to 5 customers that you know, watch how they use it, watch how they misuse it. What's really important though is to make sure these 5 customers differ from your existing 10 customers that you interviewed. Otherwise, you risk solving a problem for a really small subset of customers. The final stage is the implementation stage. So here you're taking everything that you've learned from stage 1 to stage 5 and you're building an MVP. Really important to note that the MVP is an iterative cycle. It's going to continuously improve based on updated feedback that you get from customers and updated insights on metrics and performance. If we look at the Airbnb example, they had taken the improved photos, they'd gone back to San Francisco and the results were in. Revenue had actually doubled to $400 per week. Now, $400 per week, it doesn't sound like much in the scheme of things, but considering revenue was flatlining at $200 per week for 8 months, doubling revenue in a matter of a few weeks, just spending some time with their customers, that's pretty amazing. So much so to the Airbnb founders that they actually made being a customer a core value of Airbnb. So if you were to go and get a job at Airbnb today, they would send you to a home, you'd pretend to be a customer, and you would document all of it and present it back to the company. This is a pretty common theme. I'd recommend this as a recipe for success. We have a similar thing at SafetyCulture where we go and do site visits. We had a similar thing at Amazon. Definitely recommend you building this into your startup from the very beginning. What I'd recommend to everyone on this call is to use a low or no code tool to create an MVP. Bubble and Google Sites are really good ones. They're incredibly low cost, if not no cost. You don't need to know how to code. You don't need to be an engineer. I've been able to get a prototype out to market in less than a day. Really good to get some customer feedback after that. So I'm going to pause on this quote quickly before I start the talk up. This is a quote that I really like. I think it sums up the design thinking process really well. The first part of the quote says, the best design user experiences get out of the way and just help people get shit done. I think that this really well articulates the fact that you have to spend a lot of time with your customers and you have to understand what they're trying to achieve. A person buys a product from you because they're trying to improve what they can achieve. The second part says, if you have to explain it, you've already failed. You can only really reach this point of intuition and simplicity by really getting prototypes in front of customers, watching how they use it and iterating and improving it off the back of that. So a few key takeaways I've put here for you to go away and action today. The first is to put people first. Always start with the customer, fully immerse yourself in their shoes, hang out where they hang out, go and speak to them. The second is to communicate visually and inclusively. Use things like prototypes to get a shared understanding and bring everyone on the same page. The third is to collaborate and co-create. Really try and work with your team, work with your customers and just get inspired by each other. The fourth is to continuously iterate. You're going to be continuously getting updated market feedback, updated customer feedback, updated insights from performance and metrics. You need to keep improving. It's actually a risk if you don't keep improving your MVP. The fifth is that ideas can come from anywhere. Some of my product team's best ideas have come from engineers, they've come from customers. It really isn't the CEO or the manager. And the final one is to be fully focused on the problem, be solution agnostic. Saying things like, I want to build an app is not the right way to approach a problem. Does the problem even need an app? I hope you've learned a lot from today. I've really enjoyed this presentation. Really happy to chat to anyone after. I'm really keen to see all of you succeed. So please feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. But for now, looking forward to some Q&A.
Thank you, Matt. That was excellent. And I appreciate the huge amount of information communicated in a short amount of time. We've been slammed with quite a few questions, so I'm going to do my best to get through them in the time that we've got left. I thought we might answer a couple in one because we've had a number of questions on the tech stack and the kind of platforms that you would recommend using for both design thinking in general, but also personas and user stories. Now, I know tools-wise, you mentioned Miro, Figma, Bubble, Google Slides. Can you talk a little bit about the tech stack to start with?
Yeah, one that I actually didn't mention in the presentation is Dovetail. We use Dovetail at SafetyCulture. They're actually in Surrey Hills, Blackbird portfolio company too. A little bit of a plug there. They are awesome to start plugging customer feedback in from all kinds of different methods. You can plug your Typeform in, you can plug intercom within a product, within an app, and you can start generating the key insights across all of your customers. I find this really neat. It helps get your engineers on the same page, and you can actually transcribe a lot of the videos and a lot of the interviews that you take into text. So just a really good one to start seeing the key insights and jobs to be done there. Other than that, the ones that I mentioned, so Miro, really good one for brainstorming, Bubble, really good one for getting MVPs out, Figma, awesome one for prototyping. And those are the main ones that I'd recommend right now.
Great. And just to clarify, when you talk about Dovetail, would you refer to that as like for a user persona and user testing tool?
User testing tool would be usertesting.com. So a really good way to get your prototype out. User persona, I would say Dovetail is really good for that. You can actually see who you're interacting with and map different personas across interviews that you do.
Great, thank you. In your opinion, what are the common challenges for teams to adopt a design thinking approach? So if you haven't already got this approach and you're transitioning to that in your team, are there common struggles or challenges that you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. I think mainly where it's misunderstood. So I'd say that, first of all, like misinterpreting going to talk to your customers, going to talk to 10 friends or 10 employees is not talking to customers. You don't uncover the best problems and insights from doing this. Second would be where you get stuck in analysis paralysis. So it's quite a long process. You can do this in as short or as long as you want. It really depends what level of depth you want to go into. And getting stuck on one of the research stages for too long can mean you don't move on to getting an actual prototype in the market. And so I would suggest time boxing it or putting a limit so you can get something out to market and get real feedback on. And the third I often see in teams is leading questions. So asking leading questions essentially introduces a bias when you're interviewing someone, and you kind of lead someone towards a particular answer. And so example I often use is, let's say you ask a customer, would you prefer the old version or the improved version? You're sort of inherently saying one is better than the other, and most likely they're going to say the improved version. Whereas if you say, would you prefer version A or version B, there's no bias in that. You've removed the bias from that question.
Gotcha. Are there any negatives that you've encountered in terms of a design thinking approach, or any drawbacks to this approach?
I think very similar to the answer above, only where it's misunderstood. And so I'd say, yeah, getting trapped in a particular area. So time box that, not understanding what talking to customers is and talking to employees, and yeah, leading questions. So yeah, I'd say very similar things there. Yeah,
absolutely. How do you see startups managing the speed of scaling? So, and how have you managed it? So, this approach, there's 6 steps potentially. How do you kind of balance that with the need to scale and grow really quickly?
Yeah, so in theory, like you would be doing this before you've fully built a team. So this essentially is, you would create a hypothesis, you would then go and validate it, and you go through these 6 steps. Now, obviously, you don't have the luxury to do that. I'm currently doing this process at the moment at work with a fully fledged team. And so you've really got to balance the delivery aspects and the design thinking process. And so you obviously want to build things that you're highly confident are going to have a high impact. But yeah, you have to sort of balance that time with, all right, we have a bit of uncertainty. We're going to create a hypothesis, really communicate that with your team and go through these hoops and take everyone along on the journey. And so I think it's a balancing act of trying to deliver things, but also bringing everyone along on the journey together.
Yeah, absolutely. And final question, what if you're the customer that you are solving for? Do you recommend a design thinking approach? And if so, how would you ensure that you're not just solving for your own, like a small set of customers or your own biases? Yeah,
that's a really good question. We in AgCrowd actually came from the problem where I wanted to invest in agriculture. And so I was essentially the customer that I was building for. And that definitely put a bit of a bias in my approach, where I assumed that I wasn't the only one that wanted to invest in agriculture and there were others. And so when I went out to market and I started asking, would you do this and would you want this? I got really positive feedback, but sort of a bite in the bum there where it didn't translate into an actual reality in the end. And so what I would do if you were the customer that you're building for is make sure that you are not the only customer. So go out, assume that there have to be other people out there, and go and validate this. Don't assume anything. Just really try and go rigorous testing and validation there. If you're the only customer, it's not a good start. So make sure there are other people out there.
Absolutely. Well, all right. That's all the time we have with Matt today. And on behalf of Blackbird and everyone here on the call, thank you so much, Matt, for sharing your journey and your advice. I hope that those on the call will join us next week for a Giants Weekly session with Pip Stocks, who's the co-founder of Hearsay, on meaningful customer metrics. And don't forget, if you're an aspiring or early stage founder, you can apply to join our new Giants community to get one-on-one mentoring, connect with future founders, and learn from exclusive resources. And you can apply to sign up for that through our website. Thanks again, Matt, and see everyone next week.